He had until the sun slid behind Arkansas Hill to act. After that, the church crew would tie his spring into their new pipe and his family's name would bleed away with the water. On that hot June Sunday in 1983, 12 volunteers climbed the gravel road to Dry Creek Bible Church's half-built hall. They carried hammers, coolers, and casseroles. They were told they were building hope. By dark, some lay under sheets in the parking lot, tagged and still. While sirens echoed through the hollow, one older man walked down off the tree line with a rifle held high and empty hands open. His name was Harlan Wade Hanley. Folks in Dry Creek called him quiet, strange, stuck in the past. What they did not see was the folder he had left behind in his truck, thick with letters, maps, and land papers. We're going to open that folder tonight. Where are you watching from? Stay with this story and judge what justice meant on that hill for yourself.
Before that folder in Wade Hanley's truck ever mattered, the town under Arkansas Hill had to come apart first. Dry Creek sat in a narrow cut of land, pinned between pine ridges and an old two-lane road. For most of the 20th century, logs rolled out, cash rolled in, and men said the mill smoke meant food on the table. By the early 1980s, the smoke was gone. The jobs went with it. Out by the road, a small gas station clung to life. Locals called it Max, after the man who ran the pumps, the grill, and the gossip. Every morning, trucks pulled in, not loaded with fresh-cut timber now, but with men hunting odd work. They leaned against hoods, watched empty log trailers crawl past, and stared up to Arkansas Hill like it held both blame and hope. Inside Max, a corkboard near the coffee pots served as the valley's notice board. Yellowed clippings from the county paper told the slow story of Dry Creek's loss. One headline announced the mill's first round of layoffs. Another, a year later, marked its temporary shutdown. That word never changed to reopening. It just faded under thumbtacks, grease, and time. Another set of clippings showed how the town tried to save itself with faith and little projects. Dry Creek Bible Church plans new fellowship hall, one small headline read. Below it, a picture showed Pastor Vernon Clay shaking hands with Raymond Pritchard, local contractor, under the white-painted steeple. A later story announced a building fund drive. Folks drove past Max, filled their tanks, and dropped spare change into coffee cans on the counter marked for the hall. Around those cans, other money moved in ways the paper never fully named. Men traded firewood, hog meat, and quiet jars for brake jobs or new roofs. Some of that shine came from hidden springs, some from creek draws, some from higher, colder places. It slipped through the hollow like a second, secret river beside the legal one of paychecks and bank loans. Water in this valley meant more than refreshment. A good spring could carry a farm through drought, build a family name, or feed an off-the-books craft. Old folks said, land's dirt without water. Deeds might list acres, but stories clung to where the cold broke out of stone. The Hanley Spring on Arkansas Hill sat at the top of that list, though most people only knew it as good water up there. Paper, at first, felt like an outsider. The older men at Max trusted a handshake more than a line in a file cabinet. Yet slowly, forms began to rule what bodies and stories once held. Foreclosure notices, car loan papers, disability claims, food stamp cards. Each slip of thin white stock set terms that even a hard man couldn't muscle aside. You could own a field since your granddad's time and still lose it if the right line on the wrong paper went against you. Church leaders understood that shift better than most. They filed for nonprofit status, kept typed minutes, and made sure every donation had a receipt. On Mac's corkboard, one flyer asked for in-kind gifts to the new hall. lumber, nails, labor, and access to a reliable water source all sat on the same list, written as if they carried equal weight. Ray Pritchard saw the world that paper was building. Work as a contractor gave him practice with bids, permits, and simple legal forms. He knew which offices stamped what and how slow a poor man's complaint moved once it hit a desk. The clippings at Max showed his name more and more. Pritchard Construction, lowest bidder on Church Hall. Deacon Pritchard oversees volunteer workdays. His face in newsprint formed a second kind of presence, one that reached beyond his fence line. From a distance, all this looks calm on the page. Men stood at the gas pumps, sipped coffee, watched trucks grind up toward the church site. Women drove past in dusty cars, children in the back seats counting the white boards stacked beside the steeple. Underneath that quiet, pressure built. No one at Max yet spoke of forged signatures or stolen water. Still, anyone reading those same clipped articles years later can trace the slow bend toward trouble. Those yellow squares pinned above a sticky counter would later sit copied in a state file box. They would help prove that long before shots cracked across Arkansas Hill, control over ink and type had already started to decide whose name counted, whose land mattered, and whose story the law chose to hear. Up on Arkansas Hill, above the gas pumps and paper clippings, the Hanley place sat back from the road under a line of old oaks. From the highway, it looked like any worn farm in the valley. Gray boards, sagging porch, antenna bent by ice storms. Only people who walked past the house and kept climbing knew the real heart of that land. There, in a shaded break of rock, clear water pushed out of limestone and ran cold every month of the year. Old folks called it the Hanley Spring long before any mapmaker wrote the word. Family stories said a scout from Daniel Boone's time first found that crack in the stone, and a Hanley boy married his daughter and would not leave. However the tale started, by 1983, 4 Hanley generations lay in the churchyard with that name on rough markers, and their kin still drew water from the same place. Wade grew up hearing that if the spring ever left the family would leave the hill. As a child, he ran barefoot in that wet moss, cupped the cold in his hands, and watched his father pour it over copper coils in the shed beside the house. Later, after a tour in Vietnam that left scars on his legs and nights full of noise, he came back to that same shed and took up the work without much talk. By the time the mill closed, Wade's hands were thick with callus from both the woods and the still. Most saw him as another tired logger who kept to himself. Inside his small bedroom, stacked on a crate under the window, stood the thing that set him apart, though almost nobody knew it was there. He kept notebooks, ledgers, and folders saved from his father and grandfather, each page filled with dates, names, barrel counts, and simple sketches of lines across hills. Some sheets held old tax receipts, where officials wrote the family name with the words Springhouse beside it. Others carried hand-drawn maps that showed the stone box, the creek it fed, fence corners, and trees that no longer stood. War had taught Wade that memory slipped and men lied, but ink stayed. In Vietnam, he wrote in tiny letters on the backs of ration cards, noting where patrols walked and who did not come home. Back on Arkansas Hill, he turned that same careful habit to his land. When he helped a neighbor move a fence, he sketched a corner and wrote the date. If the church asked to park cars on his field for a homecoming, he marked how many rows they used and which elder had shaken his hand. Ruth, his wife, saw the stacks of paper as one more quirk in a man full of quiet rules. She cared more about the weather, the garden, and whether their boys would find steady work in a town that seemed to empty a little each year. Joel and Tommy grew up hauling buckets from the spring, running through the woods and hearing half-spoken talk about not sharing certain family things with outsiders. They knew there was a recipe, though nobody set it out for them word for word yet. On Sundays, Wade sat with Ruth and the boys in a back pew at Dry Creek Bible Church, boots clean, shirt pressed, eyes fixed on the floor more than the pulpit. He bowed his head with the rest when Pastor Clay spoke of service, charity, and building the hall, yet he never raised his hand when leaders asked for land or water. In that same sanctuary where Wade kept his hand still, another man's rose easy. Raymond Ray Pritchard sat 2 rows ahead, broad-shouldered, hair neat, tie a little too bright. He passed the plate, stacked chairs, smiled at every child who slipped past his knees. Away from Sunday, his numbers did not look solid at all. Mill repairs had dried up. 2 trucks sat on loans past due. His wife stretched paychecks, cut pills in half, and hoped the boys didn't read the pink notices on the table. Years before the building fund, Ray had worked a quiet deal with Wade. He hauled jugs of legal spring water down from Arkansas Hill and sold them to cafes along the highway. During those visits, Ray stepped inside the Hanley spring house, saw the copper, smelled the mash, and watched which barrels Wade marked with a small penciled star. That star and the word recipe spoken in low tones stuck in his mind. To Ray, pressed by banks, it started to look like a tool left lying on the bench. If a man handled that tool right, he thought, maybe he could build something bigger than a few jugs sold for cash. When Dry Creek Bible Church voted to raise a new fellowship hall, Ray heard a chance. The hall needed a kitchen, toilets, and water the town lines couldn't always give. Up the slope, the Hanley Spring ran strong through every dry spell anyone could recall. On paper, an old survey left the border near that rock face fuzzy, a line that could be cleaned up. One clear Thursday, while Wade cut timber in another county, Ray walked the ridge above the church with that survey in a plastic sleeve. He pushed a few bright flags a little farther toward the spring and told himself it was only fixing what age had blurred. The next week, he carried a corrected description to the courthouse, paid a fee, and left with a stamped page saying the church lot reached near the stone box where Hanley water rose. With that page in hand, he went further. In a lean-to behind his own house, he bottled clear liquid in cheap glass and stuck on labels that read Arkansas Hills Spring Water. He passed the Hanley recipe, in pieces, to his sons and 2 cousins, teaching them how much corn, how much sugar, how long to wait before drawing off the best run. Soon, cases rolled out in his truck under the same hill name Wade's people had carried for generations. Sunday, he paused by the board near the door. A newspaper ad, pinned there, offered Arkansas Hill spring water for sale. Beside it, under the same thumbtack, hung a fresh copy of the corrected land paper. Simple map shaded so that the spring seemed to sit inside church improvement ground. Many men would have torn it down. Wade did not. He stood still, read each line slowly, and memorized the book and page numbers stamped at the bottom. On a scrap from his pocket, he copied those numbers, folded the paper once, and tucked it into the same notebook where he kept barrel counts and fence sketches. By the time he drove home that afternoon, the hurt had shifted. This was no longer only about talk or a few jars carried down a hill. Ink and law now said his water, his hill's name, and his family's craft belonged on someone else's page. That thin stamped sheet in the foyer forced a hard choice, one that no neighbor could make for him. That choice waited. But it did not stay quiet for long. Wade drove off Arkansas Hill with the book and page number pressed warm against his chest, the paper damp from sweat. Gravel popped under his tires. In the cab, the radio hummed low, some country song about hard times that sounded too close to home. He turned it off and let the truck roll in silence down toward the creek. Back at the Hanley place, Ruth called from the porch about supper. Yet he walked past her and went straight to the small back room where he kept his box. The door clicked shut behind him. On the floor, he dragged out a dented metal trunk, the one his father had carried home from war. Inside lay folders, bound notebooks, and old envelopes tied with string. The smell of paper, dust, and faint tobacco rose into the still air. From the top of the stack, he pulled 3 things and laid them side by side on the bed. First, an army letter his father wrote home in 1944, where he told Ruth's grandfather that the only good water I ever knew sat under that rock above the house, and I'll stand guard over it when I get back. Second, a tax receipt from 1958 listing Spring House Outbuilding under the Hanley name. Third, a survey sketch his grandfather had drawn in pencil, with a small cross where the rock box sat and Hanley Spring written in shaky letters. Next, he opened his own ledger where he had copied the deed numbers from the church board. Under those lines, he started a fresh page. In slow, blocky script, he wrote dates, places, and names. He noted each time the church had asked to park cars on his field, each handshake he had given, and how far the cars came toward the spring. He wrote that he had never signed any paper giving the water away. At the bottom of the page, he added what he'd seen that morning: the new church notice, the shaded map, the words Arkansas Hill Spring Water on Ray's ad. Beside it, he wrote the number stamped in blue ink at the footer. That line linked their fresh claim back to the old proof held in his trunk. The chain, once drawn, was clear to him, even if no judge ever saw it. For a short hour, Wade pictured another path. He saw a lawyer in a strip mall office, saw himself laying out letters and slips on a wide desk. Maybe the man in a suit could march this stack into a hearing room, point to the forged lines, and make some panel order the pipe pulled. Then another thought followed close. The church boards sitting as polite witnesses, Ray shaking hands in hallway, Pastor Clay praying for peace while the trench filled anyway. Court costs piled up in his mind like cut logs that nobody could sell. He had watched neighbors fight banks and timber companies. The ones with less money and fewer friends at the courthouse often lost, even when paper said they were right. In his bones, Wade felt the weight of that truth. By the time any judge moved, he believed the pipe would be set, barrels would run under Ray's label, and the Hanley Spring would belong to rumor, not law. Yet the habit of writing things down did not leave him. Instead of closing the trunk, he pulled out a manila envelope and began to fill it. Into that sleeve went copies of the army letter, the old receipt, the sketch, and the fresh ledger page. On top, he placed a short note to Sheriff Benton, plain and direct, laying out how the water had passed from talk to maps to ads without his say. The next afternoon, he drove to the small clapboard house where Linda Mae Crowder lived near the church. She kept the minutes, typed the bulletins, and balanced the giving ledgers. She also shared a branch of his family tree. In her tidy kitchen, over weak instant coffee, he slid the envelope across the table and asked her to hold it for a rainy day. She saw his eyes, read the name on the front, and tucked it into her own metal file box without questions. Walking back to his truck, Wade looked up toward Arkansas Hill. A fresh workday for the fellowship hall sat marked on the church calendar. Men would come with hammers and pipe, ready to tie the spring to the new walls. As he started the engine, he circled that date in his mind, not as a meeting, but as an ending. The papers were in trusted hands now. What came next, he believed, would not be settled by ink alone.
The days between that drive from Linda's house and the marked Sunday moved heavy. Wade worked his logging job, fixed a loose hinge on the barn, and helped Ruth weed the beans. But every small task sat under one hard thought. Men would soon stand on his ridge with pipe and shovels. Once those lines lay in the trench, he believed no judge or elder would ever give his spring back. On Thursday afternoon, he eased his truck onto a muddy spur road that cut across the face of Arkansas Hill. From there, he could look down through pines at the church lot. Men in work shirts pushed a rented ditcher, its engine whining as it chewed a crooked brown scar across the slope. Long white PVC lay in stacks beside the cut, clean and bright against the red dirt. He watched until a familiar pickup rolled into view from the lower road. Ray Pritchard's blue truck rattled to a stop where the spur met the lane. Wade saw Ray step out, wave an arm toward the ditch, and laugh at something one of the younger men said. That easy grin scored deeper than any shovel. To Wade's eye, it looked like a man smiling over loot spread on a table. He pulled his small notebook from his shirt pocket. Against the truck hood, he wrote the date, the hour, and a short line. Ray on site, overseeing pipe from spring toward hall. The pencil marked steady despite the heat. When he finished, he slid the book back and felt the shape of it press into his ribs like a second, smaller weapon. Before he could drive off, Ray's truck turned up the spur. The blue hood rose in his mirror, dust rolling. Wade stepped out and waited in the narrow strip of shade where the road bent around a stand of scrub oak. Gravel crunched as Ray braked 10 feet away. For a breath, the two men only looked at each other, hill and pipe and church hanging between them like an unseen wire. Ray leaned on his open door. "You out here huntin', Wade?" he asked, trying for light talk. Wade's voice came low. "I'm here for my water." He nodded toward the ditch below. "That line crosses my ground. It carries my spring. You need to pull it." The false ease dropped from Ray's face. "Paper at the courthouse says different," Ray replied. "Church needs that hookup. Town needs it. You can't stop progress with an old story." Wade heard the words, not just as an argument, but as a verdict on his whole line. To Ray, the spring was a tool, stamped and claimed. To Wade, it was the only thing that had stayed his through war, layoffs, and the slow thinning of the valley. He stepped back, letting the truck pass. As the tires rolled by his boots, he knew talk had reached its end. That night, clouds stacked over the ridge, hiding the weak moon. Wade left the house after Ruth and the boys lay down, rifle in hand, boots soft on the path above the spring. He did not walk toward the church. Instead, he cut across the slope where the new trench shone pale in the dark from disturbed clay. Lengths of pipe lay waiting beside it. Wade knelt, raised the rifle, and put 3 shots through the section. Plastic burst, echoing up and down the hollow. Water from the spring spilled out and ran along the trench. When echoes faded, he walked home without looking back. Later, rain hid the broken line. By dawn, the rain had washed red clay down the trench. Mud filled the low spots. Split pipe lay half hidden. Men from the church arrived with coffee and tool belts. They found water pooling where it should not be. Ray drove up late, saw the damage, and felt heat rise in his face. He knew who had done it, even without tracks. Sheriff Benton came out, took photos, and wrote a short note in his log. On paper, it went down as vandalism. In quiet talk by the trucks, it became a warning. Later that morning, the real work shifted to town. The feed store on Main Street served as Dry Creek's other office. Folks bought seed and salt there, but they also traded news and made plans in the dusty back room. A yellow light hung low over an old table. Receipts curled in a box on a shelf. 2 drink machines hummed in the corner. It was a place men trusted more than any office with carpet. Wade met his brother by marriage there, a sturdy man named Virgil Crowder. Virgil had hauled logs with him, hunted deer with him, and once pulled his truck out of a snowbank. If there was anyone in town who might stand beside him, Wade thought it would be this man. The two of them sat at the table while sacks of feed thumped past the thin wall. Dust floated in the light between them. Words came hard for Wade, yet he laid out the story as plain as he could. He spoke of the spring, the old maps, the new deed on the church board, and the ad that used his hill's name. He told Virgil about the pipe, the ditcher, and the rifle shots in the night. Virgil listened, arms crossed, jaw tight. He understood the code that tied a man to his ground. He also had a wife who sang in the choir and a son on the church youth list. It would have taken only a few words from Virgil to turn that back room into a planning spot for a legal fight. He might have offered names of men with tractors who would block the trench, or a cousin who knew a lawyer in the next county. Instead, he shifted in his chair, stared at his hands, and spoke of keeping peace. He said the church meant a lot for struggling families. He said nobody wanted trouble with the law. From his point of view, Wade's stand was right in spirit, but deadly in practice. After that talk, Wade walked out past the stacked feed with a new kind of emptiness. Wade had not turned against him, not in open words, yet he had stepped back from the line. For a man raised on stories of neighbors joining in at hard times, that retreat cut deep. In his mind, one more support post under his life had cracked. From here on, he understood whatever came on Arkansas Hill would rest on his own shoulders. While Wade's boots carried him home, Ray drove the other way, toward the small office behind the church sanctuary. On a metal desk there, Linda May stacked bills, typed bulletins, and kept a neat folder for the small water company the two men had run together. Ray laid down fresh forms that named him sole owner and showed a stiff version of Wade's name on the signature line. Linda had watched Wade's signs since grade school. She knew that stroke was off and peeled one carbon copy to slip into her drawer. As Linda slid the thin blue sheet into her drawer, a tight ache settled under her ribs. The strokes on that line weren't Wade's. She'd typed his name on checks and lists for years. The one on Ray's form looked stiff, like a child copying a teacher's hand. She closed the drawer slow, turned off the office light, and told herself she'd think about it tomorrow. Ray left the church with those same forms under his arm. In his mind, the problem was almost solved. Papers showed him as sole owner now. The pipe would be patched. The hall would have water. All he needed was one more good workday to push the line across the last stretch of ground. He decided to call a planning meeting at his own house. That way, talk would stay friendly, off-record, away from men like Wade. By evening, folding chairs filled Ray's small living room. A coffee table held plans, pencils, and a plate of store cookies. Pastor Clay sat near the window, hat in his lap. Two deacons leaned over blueprints spread flat. A cousin of Ray's who'd helped with bottling sprawled by the door. Children ran in and out from the kitchen, giggling until wives shooed them toward the yard. On the far side of town, Joel Hanley sat on his parents' porch steps, hands locked between his knees. He'd heard about the trench, the broken pipe, and the visit to the feed store. Wade hadn't said much, but the tight way he moved told its own story. When Joel's friend mentioned the meeting at Ray's house, something inside the boy clicked. He thought of his father's notebooks, the careful lines and dates. Then he thought of another way to catch truth. In his room sat an old cassette recorder he'd used for school. The plastic was cracked, but the reels still turned. He slipped in a fresh tape, checked the red light, and slid the machine into his jacket pocket. To his mother, he said he was going to help with chairs. Ruth looked at his face and almost stopped him, then let the door swing shut. Ray's porch light burned yellow when Joel walked up the gravel drive. He stayed outside, saying he'd mind the kids, but asked if he could hang his jacket on a nail by the open window. The recorder inside hummed to life, its tiny wheels spinning. Through the thin wall, voices carried clear. "All right," Ray began inside, paper rustling as he tapped the plans. "We're close.
Next Sunday, we run this line straight up, hook right into the best source on this hill. After that, nobody up there can shut us off." Pastor Clay sounded uneasy. "Ray, we still haven't got Wade fully on board. Maybe we should sit with him again." Ray's answer came quick. "We've sat, we've talked. He's stuck 50 years back. The church has a corrected survey. County stamped it. Once that pipe's glued and buried, there's no sense reopening that can of worms." Laughter rippled from one of the cousins. Another man asked, "What if he tears it up again?" "We'll cross his fence with the law behind us. Papers in our favor. Sheriff can't argue with that. You'll see. We're finally putting that old hill to work for more than jars in a shed." On the porch, Joel's stomach turned. The way Ray said jars felt like a spit on every late night he'd watched his father carry buckets, on every story his granddad had told. He heard the scrape of chairs as they talked shifts, trucks, and which volunteers to call. Names rolled out, men who'd helped bottle, deacons who'd signed forms, even Ray's own sons, Bobby and Eli, listed as runners for the trench. Joel stared at the jacket hanging by the window. That little box trapped every word, spinning them into brown tape that couldn't forget. A car door slammed down the hill, one of the neighbors leaving. Children chased each other in the yard, unawares. When the meeting broke, Joel grabbed his jacket and mumbled thanks. He walked fast into the dark, not stopping until the glow from Ray's porch faded behind trees. At the edge of the Hanley yard, he slowed and pressed the recorder to his chest. The tape had caught more than plans. It held Ray's own voice claiming the spring, mocking the jars, and leaning on stamped lines no Hanley had ever agreed to. Inside the house, Wade sat at the table, ledger open. Joel set the recorder beside it and pushed play. As Ray's words filled the small kitchen, Wade's jaw tightened. He reached out, stopped the tape, then rewound it with careful fingers. This, he knew, was no story carried by gossip. This was proof a stranger could hear.
After the tape stopped spinning in the Hanley kitchen, the house went very still. Wade sat with his fingers on the recorder, feeling the soft click as he pushed it shut. Ray's voice still rang in the room. Talk of corrected lines, law behind the pipe, and putting that old hill to work. It was no longer rumor. The theft had a tone, a shape, and a date. In Wade's mind, the last doubt about what Ray meant to do slipped away. Down the narrow hall, a trapdoor opened into the root cellar. Wade lifted it and stepped into cool air that smelled of earth and old potatoes. Bare bulbs swung on a wire. Shelves held jars, tools, and the battered green trunk that had followed him from war to home. He dragged it to the workbench and flipped the latches. Papers rustled like dry leaves. From inside, he pulled every scrap tied to the spring, the army letter, the tax receipt, the hand-drawn maps. He added the torn newspaper ad for Arkansas Hill Spring Water, the number he'd copied from the church deed, and a clean notebook page where he'd listed the day the pipe trench cut his slope. Last, he placed the cassette in its plastic case on top of the stack. On the bench lay a sheet of lined paper. He sat, uncapped a pen, and began a letter to Sheriff Carl Benton. The words came slow but steady. He wrote how his family had held the spring before any courthouse, how the water fed both their house and their craft. He listed every time the church had used his field with only spoken thanks, never with signed terms. He named Ray as partner in a small water business and wrote plainly that he had never signed away his share. Midway through, he turned his pen to the part he hated most. In that careful hand, he admitted that he had fired into the pipe, that he planned to stand against any further crossing, and that he believed the system would not stop Ray before the line was fixed in place. He did not threaten. He simply laid out what had already occurred and what he feared would come if the law stayed slow. Carbon paper lay in an old desk drawer from years of farm forms. He slid a blue sheet under his letter and wrote on, pressing hard so each stroke cut through. When he finished, he pulled apart the original and the copy. One he folded into an envelope marked for Sheriff Benton, to be opened if I fall. The carbon copy he slipped into the larger manila sleeve that already held his proof. Another envelope he addressed to Ruth and boys. Into that he tucked a shorter note, more apology than argument, along with a list of where other copies of his papers sat, in Linda's house, in the trunk, in a coffee can under the springhouse steps. If everything else burned, he wanted them to know where his side of the story slept. On a low shelf leaned the rifle he had carried since his first years back from overseas. He broke it open, cleaned the bore, checked each round, and filled 2 small cartridges rows in a canvas bag. Beside the weapon, he laid out a hand-drawn map of the church site and the ridge above it. With a carpenter's pencil, he marked trees, roof peaks, and the likely spots where men would stand to run pipe or carry boards. Lines from those marks led back to shaded ovals where he could lie unseen. Upstairs, floorboards creaked. Ruth moved through the kitchen, setting plates for breakfast. Joel and Tommy argued in low voices about work and town and whether their father would go down there on Sunday. Wade heard every word, but stayed below, hunched over his map. He felt their fear like weight on his shoulders, yet the choice he'd made in his mind did not shift. Near midnight, he climbed back into the kitchen. Ruth stood by the sink, eyes red, dish towel in her hands. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. Wade answered only by taking her hand and pressing the envelope with her name in it. She knew better to open it now. She slid it into the flour bin, under the sack, where she kept things she hoped never to need. Before dawn on the chosen Sunday, cool air wrapped the hill. The boys lay awake but silent in their beds. Wade carried the larger envelope marked for the sheriff out to his truck and set it on the passenger seat. Beside it went the manila sleeve for Linda, rubber-banded tight. The rifle and canvas bag lay under an old coat, hidden but close. As he turned the key, the sky in the east just hinted gray. Headlights swept across the yard, up past the shadowed oaks, and onto the rutted road that climbed toward Dry Creek Bible Church. Gravel rattled. From a distance, his truck looked like any other man heading up to help build a hall. Inside the cab, beside the worn driver's seat, ink and steel waited together. Morning light met Wade's truck as it climbed the last bend before the church drive. Dew still clung to grass along the ditch. Ahead, he saw cars and pickups parked in crooked rows below the white steeple. Women in work shirts unloaded ladders and boards. Women set casseroles on folding tables under a big oak. Hammers and laughter carried thin in the cool air. From the road, nothing yet marked this as a place history would later circle in red. Inside his cab, the envelope for Sheriff Benton lay on the seat. The rifle rested under the old coat. Wade's jaw was tight, eyes fixed. When he turned into the gravel lot, a few men waved, thinking he'd come to help. Dust rose behind his tires and hung there, pale against the sky. What happened next, the court records would call a series of rapid, aimed discharges from a fixed position. Survivors' stories add other pieces: the crack of the first shot bouncing off the pine ridge, the way birds rose from the trees behind the hall, the sharp chemical smell that mixed with sawdust and spilled coffee. By the time the echo of the last shot died, 12 bodies lay scattered from the hall door to the far line of parked trucks. Some fell with tools still in their hands. Others collapsed beside coolers and casserole dishes. A red splash stained the new concrete. One victim, a young father, lay half under the fellowship wall he'd been framing, his tool belt skewed. Down at the base of the hill, a call crackled over the sheriff's radio. Shots fired at Dry Creek Bible Church, multiple down. Benton whipped his cruiser around, tires sliding in gravel, lights strobing the trees. Sirens from town and the next county over joined his as word spread faster than any bulletin ever had. At the foot of the driveway, he met a stream of cars fleeing, faces white, mouths moving too fast for him to catch every word. "He's gone crazy! People are dead! Up by the hall!" He pushed past them, hands tight on the wheel. When Benton stepped out at the top, his first impression was of stillness. Tools lay where they'd dropped. Boards leaned against sawhorses. Smoke from a knocked-over grill drifted low. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw the bodies. Deputies moved in a wide line, counting softly, checking for signs of life. A few injured groaned. Those went first to folding tables that became makeshift triage. The rest were covered with sheets pulled from the fellowship supply closet. Behind the new wall, troopers found shell casings spaced at even gaps along the tree line. Ballistics later showed the shots had come from 3 main positions, all with clear sight lines to men who'd signed the water papers or laid the pipe. Ray lay near the ditch, chest dark, hand still clutching a length of PVC. His sons, Bobby and Eli, rested 10 yards away, bracelets from youth groups still on their wrists. Near the edge of the lot, a county truck sat with its driver's door open and keys still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay a large envelope marked in block letters, for Sheriff Benton. A deputy called out when he saw it, holding it between 2 fingers like something fragile. Benton took it, thumbed the seal, and felt the thickness inside. Right then, Wade walked out of the trees above the hall, rifle held high by the barrel, empty hands spread. His face was gray under the brim of his hat. Witnesses later said he looked more like a man finishing a job than starting a fight. Deputies shouted, guns drawn, but Wade didn't run. He knelt, laid the weapon on the gravel, and crossed his wrists without being told. As they cuffed him, Benton slipped the envelope under his arm. Powder smell mixed with pine and the faint sweetness of a spilled dessert. In that moment, the sheriff saw only a massacre and a man who had made it. He didn't yet know that the pages under his arm would link each sheet on his desk to every body on that ground, turning a hill of blood into the center of a deeper map. By late afternoon, the bodies had left the hill, but the paper that might explain them lay unmarked on Sheriff Benton's desk. The squad room in Dry Creek was small. 2 metal desks, a humming Coke machine, and a filing cabinet that stuck on the bottom drawer. Mud from the church lot still clung to Benton's boots as he sat, laid the envelope flat, and stared at Wade Hanley's name written in block letters on the front. He broke the seal with his thumb. Inside sat a neat stack. On top lay a letter in square, slow lines. The first line spoke of family, water, and land. Wade wrote that the spring had carried the Hanley name longer than the courthouse had stood. He listed old tax slips, surveys, and times the church had used his pasture. The tone wasn't wild. It read like a man giving sworn testimony no one had asked for. Under the letter, Benton found copies. An Army note from 1944 mentioned standing guard over the spring. A faded county receipt marked Springhouse Outbuilding. Hand-drawn maps showed the stone box, tree lines, and fence corners. A torn ad for Arkansas Hill spring water carried Ray Pritchard's name. A ledger page, every line dated, logged talks with Ray, pipe sightings, and the night the trench was shot up. In one corner, Wade had written the book and page number of the church deed. A soft step in the doorway made Benton look up. Detective Marianne Holt stood there, state badge on her belt, slim case in her hand. She'd driven in as soon as word of 12 down at a church hit the radio. She took in the mud, the open envelope, and Benton's tight jaw, then asked for a clear table and fresh paper on the wall. They stripped an old fishing calendar from the bulletin board and taped up blank sheet. Holt worked quick and quiet. She pinned photos of each victim in a loose ring. Beside every face, she fixed an index card. Name, age, job, any link Benton knew to the church build or the water deal. More than half the cards got notes like pipe crew, board member, or handled sales. When Benton slid Wade's packet across, Holt pulled on thin gloves and read. Her eyes moved fast, but she did not skim. She underlined dates, circled names that matched her cards, and drew arrows from Wade's notes to Ray's picture. The rough story that had lived only in Wade's head now spread across the squad room wall in red and blue ink. An hour later, Linda May eased in, purse clutched tight. Her face had the washed-out look of someone who'd cried in the car. From that purse, she pulled the manila sleeve Wade had left in her kitchen and the thin blue carbon from Ray's new water papers. She told Holt about typing minutes, seeing the wrong stroke in Hanley, and hiding that copy in her desk. Each piece she laid down grew another branch from Ray's name on the board. At the bottom of Linda's pile lay a cassette in a cracked case. Ray's house, meeting, written faint in pencil. In a side office, Holt pushed it into an old tape deck, pressed play, and listened. Ray's own voice rolled out, talk of corrected lines, law behind us, and putting that old hill to work. Other men's names surfaced in the background, voices matching faces already pinned on the wall. When the tape clicked off, Holt opened her notebook. On a clean page, she wrote that the likely motive was tied to land and water rights, maybe theft of a recipe and brand. Victims linked by roles in the pipe project, forged deeds, or water sales. A second note said Wade had tried to push his claim through letters and trusted hands before he ever raised a gun. By evening, copies of Wade's pages, Linda's carbons, and a typed summary of the tape sat in a thick folder marked for the district attorney and the state attorney general. Wade would still stand trial for 12 killings, yet because of that folder, the story that followed him into court would not be of a man who just snapped on a Sunday. It would also be of ink, signatures, and a slow theft that crawled through offices long before bullets crossed Arkansas Hill.
Word about the papers didn't stay in the squad room for long. In a small town, nothing ever does. By the next morning, the diner on Main had turned into a kind of court, with formica tables for benches and coffee cups for gavels. Mabel's Cafe sat across from the courthouse, its big front window fogged by bacon smoke and steam. Old men took their same booths. Young mothers slid into corner seats with toddlers and crayons. A line of hats tilted toward the counter, where a radio whispered updates about the Arkansas Hill Church shooting. One group clustered near the pie case, close enough for their words to mix with the clink of dishes. A retired mill hand named Jesse shook his head and said, "Wade's lost his mind. 12 folks dead. Church folks." His voice carried farther than he meant. From the next stool, a woman in a faded choir dress answered, "You warned him. You know he did. That spring's been Hanley since before any of us. Stealing a man's water is stealing his grave." Her eyes shone hot, even as her spoon traced slow circles in cold coffee. Near the back, Linda sat with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, listening. She hadn't told anyone outside the sheriff's office that she held Wade's packet for weeks, that the blue carbon in her drawer matched a forged line under Ray's name. Every time someone said church board, her shoulders tightened. Talk split sharp along lines you couldn't see on a map. Families who'd lost someone on the hill struggled to hear past their own grief. A widow at one table said, "I don't care what papers he had. My Bobby went up there to help, not to steal." Heads around her nodded, slow and solemn. At another table, a logger with sawdust still on his boots muttered, "Ray had no business running that pipe without Wade signing on. My granddaddy always said you don't touch another man's spring, not with your hands, not with a pen." The man across from him replied, "He should have got a lawyer. You don't answer ink with bullets." Silence followed that line.
like both knew lawyers cost more than any of them had. Mid-morning, a stranger walked in. No cap, city shoes, a notebook tucked under his arm. He introduced himself to Mabel as a reporter from downstate and took a seat by the window. Folks watched him in the glass, their reflections mixing with his. Now their words might end up on paper too, not just in air and memory. He asked careful questions. How long has the Hanley family had that spring? What kind of man was Ray? Did anyone hear talk of forged deeds? Some answered, some turned away. A few gave both men hard edges and soft centers. Wade was quiet, worked hard, never started a fight, Jesse admitted, but he finished one on Sunday. Another said, Ray'd help you fix a roof and then overcharge you on the bill. Between questions, the reporter jotted down phrases locals used without thinking. Mountain code, you don't cross a line, paper folks in the capital. He underlined one sentence Linda finally let slip almost by accident. He wrote it all down because he didn't trust anybody to listen till there was blood. Outside, the courthouse steps stayed empty. No big protest formed, no march. The people of Dry Creek held their verdicts in coffee cups and whispers instead. Some called Wade a monster. Others called him a warning no one had heeded in time. Nearly everyone, even those who hated what he'd done, agreed on one quiet point. The system had never made room for a man like him to fight over something like a spring. As plates clattered and the lunch rush grew, Linda finished her coffee and rose. Her chair scraped the tile. For a moment, all the talk around her dipped. She knew she'd soon have to sit in a real courtroom, under oath, and speak about carbon copies and taped meetings. The story she carried inside her file box had already started to shape how folks spoke Wade's name. Soon, it would shape what the law itself wrote beside it. The county jail sat behind the courthouse, a low brick block with narrow windows. 2 days after the hill turned red, Wade waited in a gray interview room, cuffs locked to a metal ring in the table. Detective Mary Ann Holt came in first, a folder under one arm and a tape recorder in her hand. Sheriff Benton followed and stood by the wall. Holt set the machine down, slid in a fresh cassette, and spoke for the tape, giving date, time, and Wade's full name. Then she passed him the rights form. He read each line and signed at the bottom. From the folder, she laid out Wade's letter to the sheriff, the copied tax slip and survey, the torn ad for Arkansas Hills Spring Water, his ledger page, Linda's blue carbon with the odd signature, and a typed sheet from the meeting tape. "Did you write this letter?" she asked. "Yes." "Are these your notes and drawings?" "They are." Every short answer tied his calm voice to each scrap now locked inside the state's file. Holt tapped the blue carbon. "Is this your signature?" Wade studied it. "No, I don't write my name that way." She slid him a pad and asked him to sign again. He wrote H.W. Hanley, the same as on the rights form. The tail of the H and the small curl of the Y matched his other marks. On Ray's form, the letters sat stiff and careful. For the tape, Holt said, "Subject denies this is his signature and provides a consistent sample." That one plain sentence would later anchor the fraud case against Ray's estate and the church board. She asked about the spring. "How long has your family used that water?" Wade answered without hurry. He told of his father and grandfather, the stone box above the house, the way old taxmen had written Spring House beside their name. He spoke of his daddy's war letter and the promise to stand guard over that rock. In her notes, Holt later underlined that phrase. A jury would hear it and feel the weight of more than one man's pride. Last, she turned to Sunday. "Why did you go up there with a gun?" The room felt small. Wade watched his fingers on the table. He said he believed the pipe would be buried before any court listened, that he had seen neighbors lose land to papers they never truly understood. He said he had tried talk, letters, and trusted hands, and that he was not asking for a free pass, only for the record to show what pushed him. When she asked, "Did you fire at those men?" he answered, "Yes, I did." No claim of fear, no word, accident. The tape caught every syllable. When they left, Holt labeled the cassette Hanley, Spring, Motive, and wrote a report saying he had confirmed the documents and the killings, while naming a clear pattern of land fraud and recipe theft by Ray Pritchard and allies. Copies of her work went to the district attorney and the state attorney general. Ray lay in the churchyard, but his hold on the story ended there. The paper trail, now blessed by Wade's own mouth, turned against him. Back in his cell, Wade lay on a thin mattress and stared at cracked paint. He knew he had tightened the chain on himself. He also knew the spring and the wrong done around it now sat where time could not easily erase it, inside the black lines of the record. The tape kept his story alive.
The trial opened on a cold morning months after the shooting. Frost rimmed the courthouse steps. People lined up early, breath hanging in the air, waiting for a seat. Inside, the main courtroom smelled of old varnish and coffee. Wooden pews creaked as neighbors, church members, and reporters filled every row. Wade came in chained, led by 2 deputies. He wore a plain jail shirt and clean jeans. His hair had gone whiter since the day on the hill. He did not look at the crowd. He kept his eyes on the judge, the flag, and the table where his court-appointed lawyer waited with a yellow pad. The prosecutor read out the charges, 12 counts of murder, plus weapons and assault counts. Each name hit the room like a hammer. Bobby Pritchard, Eli Pritchard, Deacon Miller. Men who had carried hymnals and 2x4s now were lines on a list. A few sobs slipped from the victims' benches. The judge asked for quiet. For a week, the state told its story. Survivors from the workday walked to the stand. One by one, they spoke of hearing shots, dropping tools, seeing men fall. A doctor described bullet paths and cause of death. A ballistics expert held up Wade's rifle, matched it to casings from the trees and to the wounds on the hill. No one in that room doubted that Wade had fired those shots. Then Detective Holt took the stand. She did not soften anything. She laid out the packets, photos, and maps. She explained how Wade's letter had reached Sheriff Benton, how Linda's envelope matched it, how the cassette from Ray's living room fit the timeline. Her words drew a second picture over the first: pipe trenches, forged lines, and a recipe carried from shed to sales route without consent. Next came Linda. Hands shaking, she told the jury about typing old minutes, seeing the strange Hanley on the new water form, and pulling that blue carbon slip. She cried when she spoke of the men in the fellowship hall. Still, she did not back away from the paper in front of her. The jury heard her say that Ray's deed changes and business filings were not right, even before blood was spilled. Joel took the stand after her. The recorder sat on the table between him and the lawyers. When the tape played, Ray's words filled the courtroom just as they had filled the Hanley kitchen. "We're close, law behind us, putting that old hill to work." Each phrase cut through the quiet. Even some of Ray's kin stared at the floor. A handwriting expert followed. He pointed to the sharp, careful strokes on the fake H.W. Hanley, and then to Wade's natural flow on the rights form and his prison letters. "This is not the same writer," he said. The jury saw, in black ink, how someone had pulled Wade's name off a shared business without his true mark. When it was the defense's turn, Wade's lawyer did not try to claim innocence. He could not. The facts were too clear. Instead, he spoke of war, layoffs, and a man whose whole worth sat in cold water under a rock. He held up the old Army letter. He talked about how Wade had written to the sheriff, how he had turned to paper and kin before ever turning to a gun. "This does not excuse what he did," he said,
But you need to know why the fuse was so long and what kept burning. The prosecutor answered that no code, no theft, no broken system gave a man the right to be judge, jury, and executioner on a church hill. He pointed to the photos of the dead. He told the jury they could see fraud and still say murder. After 2 days of talks behind a closed door, the jury came back. On each count of murder, they said guilty. The judge's face stayed sad and hard. State law allowed death, but the jury had spared it, giving Wade life terms instead. He stacked them so he would never walk free. "You will die in prison," he said. Yet the hearing did not end there. In a later session, using the same packet and tape, the court voided the forged deed changes. It named the Hanley family as rightful holders of the spring. Claims tied to Ray's estate and the church corporation were struck. Money from Ray's property and the water business was set aside for limited payments, some to widows, some to Ruth, whose land had been almost taken on paper. So the record closed with two truths side by side. Wade Hanley became in law a mass murderer. The same pages that helped send him away also burned Ray's theft into the books forever and tied the spring back to the name it had carried long before any surveyor came up that hill.
After the verdict, Wade left the county jail in shackles on a gray morning and rode a prison bus east toward the state penitentiary. Frost still clung to the fields along the highway. Inside the bus, chains rattled every time they hit a bump. 9 other men rode with him, eyes forward, wrists locked to their belts. A guard sat near the front with a shotgun across his knees, staring at the road rather than the faces behind him. The state prison sat on a flat rise miles from any town, a wide rectangle of concrete and razor wire. Watchtowers rose at the corners like bare trees. Inside the front gate, intake officers took his picture, rolled his fingertips in ink, and gave him a number that would follow him for the rest of his life. They collected his belt, his boots, and the folded copy of the rights form he had carried from the county cell. In his first weeks, Wade moved like most new inmates do, quiet, careful, watching. He learned the count times, the meal lines, the way officers used short commands to keep bodies flowing through narrow halls. He kept to himself on the yard, walking slow laps along the fence, eyes on the sky rather than the clusters of younger men who lifted weights and smoked near the bleachers. Letters from home reached him every few weeks. Ruth wrote on ruled paper torn from school notebooks, telling him about weather, bills, and the boys. Joel found work at a small repair shop in town. Tommy took shifts at a feed mill 2 counties over. Neither job paid much, but they kept food on the Hanley table. The words between Ruth's lines said even more. The church pews were emptier. Some folks glared at her in the store. Others touched her arm and whispered that they understood, though she doubted they really did. Wade answered in the same tight hand he had used on his ledgers. He never once wrote that he was innocent. Instead, he told Ruth where to find things: the coffee can under the springhouse steps, the extra maps in the green trunk, the spare cassette he had hidden behind the pantry boards. He asked about the spring in almost every letter. "Is the water still clear?" he wrote. "Has anyone come near the box?" Ruth always said the same. The pipe was gone, the trench grown over, and the only sound up there was water on stone and wind in the oaks. One day, a prison caseworker called his name and walked him to a small office with file cabinets along one wall. A young lawyer from a legal aid group sat waiting with a thin briefcase. She had read about the trial and the later rulings on the deeds. She told Wade there was a way to fix the spring's future so no new paper shuffle could steal it again. It would not touch his sentence. It would only shape what happened to the land after he died. Over several visits, they worked through forms that felt to Wade like a second kind of confession.
He signed a will leaving the farm in spring to Ruth and the boys. He signed papers creating a small conservation trust in the Hanley name, placing strict rules on the water. No sale to companies, no large lines without family consent, no transfer to any church or business. If his sons chose to keep the place wild, the state would back them. If they chose to farm it, the spring would sit under their control.
Years slid by while Wade's days blurred inside cinder block walls. Out in Dry Creek, time moved slower, marked not by counts and yard calls, but by visits to a grassy hill outside town where a new row of stones caught the morning sun. The cemetery sat on a rise above the road, fenced with rusted wire and dotted with cedar. Older markers leaned, names almost worn flat. Near the top, a straighter line of granite shared the same date of death, June 12, 1983. Bobby Pritchard, Eli Pritchard, Deacon Harold Miller. 9 others who'd gone up Arkansas Hill to swing hammers that Sunday and never come home. One autumn afternoon, Ruth Hanley parked her car by the gate and walked the gravel path with a bunch of wildflowers in her hand. Joel and Tommy followed a few steps behind, taller now, shoulders bent in the same way Wade's had been. They stopped first at the Pritchard stones. Someone had left plastic roses there, colors faded by seasons. In Ruth's purse lay a folded envelope from the court clerk. Inside, a notice explained how money from Ray's estate and the dissolved water business had been divided. Each family who lost someone on the hill had received a payment. The sums were modest, barely enough to clear a small loan or cover a few months' wages. Still, they were something, pulled from the same paper that once nearly took the Hanley Spring. Across town in a cramped kitchen, one widow used that check to pay off the last of a hospital bill from before the shooting. She pressed her palm flat on the receipt from the clinic, then on the court notice, as if holding down 2 kinds of past at once. No check could replace the empty chair at her table, yet she understood that without Wade's packets and Linda's blue carbon, there might have been no reckoning at all. Ray's papers would have stayed clean in their files. For Ruth, the money meant she could fix the sag in the barn roof and buy a used truck so Joel didn't have to hitch rides to work. More important, it meant she wouldn't have to sell the hill outright to cover taxes. The trust Wade signed from prison wrapped the spring in rules. The settlement wrapped her in just enough security to breathe. Not everyone saw those papers as blessing. Some Pritchard King refused the checks at first, saying they wouldn't touch murder money. A few later changed their minds, quiet and ashamed, when past due slips piled up. Others tore the envelopes in half and left them in a drawer. To them, Wade's neat handwriting on old maps would always be the shadow behind their grief. Joel and Tommy felt the pull from both sides. In town, they heard whispers when they walked into Mac's or Mabel's. Those are Wade's boys. Some voices held blame, others carried a rough respect. On Sundays, they sometimes sat at the very back of the church, or not at all, unsure whether the steeple pointed them towards comfort or judgment. Up on their own land, things were clearer. The pipe trench had sunk, grass knitting over the scar until only someone who knew where to look could trace its path. The spring still pushed out of stone, cold and steady. A small metal sign, set there after the trust went through, read, "Hanley Spring, Protected Easement." The words were simple, but for the boys, they carried the full weight of their father's fight. They argued in low private talks about what to do with that gift and wound. Joel wanted to keep the recipe locked away, feeling any use of it would taste of blood. Tommy thought about legal bottling, done right this time, with full permits and open books. Both knew the story in town would shape whatever they chose. A bottle bearing the Arkansas Hill name might draw curiosity or protest or both. In living rooms across the valley, families of the dead talked in similar circles. Some blamed only Wade. Others spread blame to Ray for starting the chain, to the church board for looking past wrong lines,
to themselves for not asking more questions when the pipe first cut earth. Yet even in anger, when they looked at their settlement letters and at the land records, they saw one thing Wade had forced into being. The truth about the theft did not die with Ray. So the families lived in a tangle of hurt and uneasy gains. The trust, the checks, and the corrected deeds did not heal what happened on Arkansas Hill. They did, however, hold one thin promise. No one would wake up one day to find that same spring quietly stolen again, their loss buried in a drawer where nobody ever looked.
2 decades after the shots on Arkansas Hill, Dry Creek looked both different and exactly the same. The mill yard, once full of stacked pine, had turned into a flat lot of weeds and busted concrete. A chain-link fence leaned around it, keep out signs flapping in the wind. On the far edge of town, however, a new complex rose behind coils of razor wire, the state prison where Wade Hanley woke and slept under numbers instead of his name. What work still flowed through Dry Creek often started or ended at that fence. Buses brought in guards, nurses, and kitchen staff from nearby counties. Gas stations sold more coffee at dawn. Mabel's Cafe kept its doors open thanks to lunch orders from officers on break. Factory jobs never came. In their place, uniforms and ID badges became the main tickets to a steady paycheck. Up on Arkansas Hill, the church still stood, smaller now in spirit than in paint. The fellowship hall had finally been finished, though no one called it by that name without a pause. A simple metal plaque by the door listed the 12 who died there in 1983. Another sign farther up the slope marked the spring, Hanley Spring, protected easement. No pipe ran from that stone box to the hall. The church drew its water from deeper city lines instead. Inside the new town hall, a brick building squeezed between the post office and a shuttered hardware store, folding chairs sat in uneven rows. On a Wednesday night, a mix of gray heads and young faces filled them. Up front, a map of the county was taped to a whiteboard. Blue lines marked creeks, red lines showed property borders, and tiny green dots marked wells and springs. A yellow star sat over Arkansas Hill. The mayor, a woman young enough to have been a child when the massacre happened, tapped that star with a wooden pointer. "We all know this place," she said. "We also know what happens when paper doesn't match what folks on the ground believe is right. We can't afford another Arkansas Hill." She explained a new draft ordinance, tighter rules for how land surveys could be altered, required notice to all bordering owners when water lines crossed property, mandatory public hearings before any church or company tied into a private source. As she spoke, older residents shifted in their chairs. Some had stood on the hill that day or buried someone who had. Others carried the story, passed down like a cautionary tale. A man near the back raised his hand. "What about outfitters bottling water upstate?" he asked. "Are they going to play by these rules?" The mayor shook her head. "We can't touch state contracts from here," she said. "But inside this county, no more deeds get corrected in a back room, not after what we've seen." In a file attached to that ordinance, buried under staples and dates, sat a familiar case citation, State v. Hanley, 1984, with notes on evidentiary significance of private land records and audio proof in rural water disputes. Wade's letter, Linda's blue carbon, and Joel's cassette had grown from personal shields into examples used by lawyers and clerks who'd never set foot in Dry Creek. Far away in the Capitol's echoing hearing room, lawmakers sat at long tables while a committee on rural resources reviewed proposed changes to state water law. A staffer clicked through slides. One showed a black-and-white photo of the unfinished fellowship hall, roped off with crime scene tape. Another displayed a typed summary, Arkansas case study, theft of spring,
forged deeds, mass violence. An older senator leaned toward his microphone. "We don't want that again," he said, "but we also can't have every boundary fight end in blood. Clearer records, required co-signatures, open hearings, these are our tools." The minutes from that day later quoted him almost word for word. No one in that room knew Wade, yet when they voted to require double notice before any spring could be tied into a larger system, his case number stood in the margin of the bill draft. Back in Dry Creek, some of those changes felt distant. The real daily fights had shifted. Pills and later meth crept into hollows where moonshine once roamed. Young men who might have learned to tend stills or log the hills now rode the prison bus in reverse, not as staff, but as inmates. Deputies filled out new forms, this time about overdoses and break-ins instead of pipe trenches. Still, the shadow of Arkansas Hill shaped small choices. When a gas company floated the idea of running a line near the Hanley land, Joel and Tommy walked into the courthouse together, copies of the trust in their hands. Clerks pulled their file, saw the protected easement stamped with the court's seal, and told the company no tie-ins would cross that spring without explicit, written consent from the Hanley heirs. The answer stopped the plan before the first survey flag went in the ground. In school classrooms, history teachers told the Arkansas Hill story in careful, trimmed versions. They skipped the recipe details, but talked about land, law, and what happens when people believe no one in power will listen to them. Students doodled in margins, yet some carried those names with them, the way older folks once carried tales of feuds and raids. The town had not healed. It had, in places, hardened over. Yet in the weave of new ordinances, trust papers, and state laws, Wade's slow, private habit of writing things down now lived in public rules. Ink that once sat hidden in a farm trunk guided how clerks filed deeds and how boards read maps. Whether that felt like victory or bitter irony depended on who you asked and how close their kin lay to the hill.
In a small office 3 hours from Dry Creek, the Arkansas Hill case lives inside cardboard and plastic instead of cedar and stone. Bankers' boxes line 2 walls, each labeled in black marker: State v. Hanley, Trial, Civil, Water and Deeds, Press Clippings, Interviews. On a metal shelf above them sit 3 cassettes in cracked cases and 1 digital copy burned to a disc. A desk lamp casts a yellow circle over a spread of papers. This is where the story turns from local wound to something closer to folklore and lesson. The researcher who keeps these files, part historian, part journalist, part archivist, was a child when the shots rang across Arkansas Hill. Now they spend evenings untying string around old envelopes, reading Wade's careful block letters, and listening to Ray's recorded voice spin out of a cheap tape deck. Spread side by side, the pieces of Wade's life look different than they did in the heat of the trial. His letter to Sheriff Benton sits next to the Army note from his father and the faded tax slip for Spring House Outbuilding. The researcher traces a finger along those lines and sees what Wade meant his paper trail to be: a shield for a small, fragile thing the law had no box for. Not money, not a big company, just a cold trickle of water and a recipe passed by mouth. Beside that truth rests the other truth: color crime scene photos, autopsy summaries, and a list of 12 names that never change no matter how often you read them. Each page has a life cut short by bullets Wade fired on purpose. Whatever he hoped his records would protect, those bodies stand in the way of any clean story of mountain justice. The researcher keeps turning pages, hunting for patterns. They find lines in Holt's reports about systemic distrust, limited legal access, and honor-based responses. They see how Ray, shaped by the same hills, chose ink and quiet theft to try to save his own struggling family. He believed a forged signature hurt less than a broken bone. Wade, looking at the same pressures, believed only firm public action could stop the erasure of his name. One man diffused the spring through sales and shares. The other tried to seal it shut with blood and paper. On another shelf, a thinner folder holds state legislative notes. In the margin of a draft bill on rural water rights, someone has scribbled, "Arkansas Hill, show what happens when no one listens." So Wade's slow habit of copying deeds and writing dates did change something. Tighter notice laws, clearer survey rules, a trust locked around one spring. All of that grows, however crookedly, from his paper trail engine. But the cost sits in the same room. Newspaper clippings show the widows at the civil hearings clutching manila folders of their own. Audio from diner interviews carries the crack in Linda's voice when she says he wrote it all down because he didn't think anybody would care until it was too late. The file labeled Impact lists a prison as Dry Creek's main employer, and a generation of kids who learned about honor and violence from a massacre instead of a tale told on a porch. Looking at all this, the researcher has to ask hard questions the law never fully answered. If Wade had relied on paper alone, letters, tape, Linda's carbon, would anyone have taken his claim seriously before the pipe was buried? If Ray had honored the old code and refused to touch the spring without a true signature, would his boys still be alive? When formal systems don't see the value of a thing, water, song, name, how far will people go to defend it on their own? The Arkansas Hill Massacre doesn't offer easy lessons. It shows how a man can be both archivist and killer, how ink can be used to steal and to shield, and how a spring can become both altar and battlefield when no common language exists between courthouse law and hilltop code. In these boxes, legacy and violence sit pressed together. Any story that tries to pull them cleanly apart is lying. On a clear fall day in the present, Arkansas Hill looks quiet again. A narrow pull-off holds 2 cars and a wooden sign put up by the county. From there, a short path climbs past scrub and saplings to the church and the spring. Leaves crackle under the shoes of visitors who only know the place from books, whispers, or videos like this one. The fellowship hall stands finished now, white paint flaking along its lower boards. Out front, a small bronze plaque lists 12 names and 1 date. People stop, read, and trace a fingertip over Bobby Pritchard, Eli Pritchard, and the others. Few of them know the full story of the pipe trench or the forged line on Ray's form. They only see "in memory" and a church that never quite filled those empty spaces again. Farther up the slope, past a line of oaks, the sound changes. Water murmurs over stone. The Hanley Spring still pushes cold out of limestone, just as it did when Wade's grandfather stacked the first rocks into a box. A metal marker stands beside it. Hanley Spring, protected easement, established 1985. Below that, smaller letters name Joel and Tommy as current trustees. No pipe runs out. The water drops into a shallow trough, then into the same small creek. Joel, gray at the temples now, sometimes walks here alone at dusk. He carries no jugs, no tools. He checks the stone, scrapes moss from the sign, and listens. Some evenings he brings his own teenagers and tells a softened version of the story, about a spring, a dispute, and a grandfather who loved his land too much to give it up the right way. He does not yet hand them the recipe. It stays locked in a tin inside the house. Town kids dare each other to come up after dark. They tell tales of a shadow with a rifle on the ridge, of voices in the trees calling names from the plaque. Older folks still sit in Mabel's and argue in low tones. One says Wade was a murderer. Another answers Ray stole that spring. Both know they're right about pieces and wrong about the whole. Dry Creek lives with that split the way it lives with prison sirens and empty mill yards. In the researcher's office miles away, the case files remain in their boxes. Copies of Wade's letter, Linda's blue carbon, and Joel's cassette transcript have been scanned into digital archives. Law students read them under fluorescent lights. Podcasters and documentary crews pull quotes and maps to build their own versions of this story. This episode you're hearing now comes from those same pages, that same careful hand that believed ink might shield a family name. Wade died in prison years ago. His body returned to the hill under a plain stone with H.W. Hanley and 2 dates. Ray lies in the same cemetery, close enough that their names share the same wind. Neither man gets the last word. The last word belongs to the spring that still runs, the trust that still holds, and the court record that ties their choices together where no one can quietly erase them. So what do we make of it? A man who wrote everything down, then picked up a gun. A partner who knew the code, then broke it with a forged line. A system that only listened to a poor hill farmer's claim once there were bodies under sheets in a church lot. The paper trail engine Wade built saved his spring and stained his legacy so dark his own grandchildren still flinch at his name. You've walked this hill with us in words. You've seen how far a man went to protect water and a name, and how many others paid with their lives. Now it's your turn. Was this justice, revenge, or something twisted between? If someone took the only thing your family ever owned and the law shrugged, how far would you go to take it back? Tell us in the comments. Share this case with someone who cares about these hills, and subscribe if you want more stories that don't let any of us look away.